There's no place like home.
Take two. So enough said. What are we going to talk about today?
I don't know. Some little film. I don't know whether you've heard of it. Hello, Garland Gabbers. Welcome to our very special podcast. It is part one of our delve into the Wizard of Oz. This is going to be our biggest podcast, so much so we've had to split it into two. So on this part one, we will be taking a brief look into the pre-production and the cast and crew, and then we will be doing our usual scene by scene breakdown. And throughout the scenes, we will be dispelling some of those nasty myths that are all over YouTube that just make our blood kill. And then part two, when we get to that next month, we will be picking up on our scene by scene breakdown, and then we will be going through post-production and the legacy of Oz. So we are absolutely delighted to have a very special guest on this month's podcast. We've been wanting him on, and he agreed to come on. So please welcome JOHN FRICKE, who has written 3 books about Judy and 4 about Oz. He's won Emmy Awards for both the PBS and Biography Garland TV documentaries, and he received a Grammy nomination for Best Album Notes for the retrospective of Judy's work on records. John has spoken about Judy at London's National Film Theatre, at the, how do you pronounce that?
Deauville.
That accent again. Deauville Film Festival in France. Carly would have been able to pronounce it because she's
a film festival in France will suffice. And all across the United States, and has appeared many times on Turner Classic Movie Channel and the Today Show, National Public Radio and the BBC. So everybody, please welcome JOHN FRICKE.
Yay!
Read it just the way I wrote it. Although I told her to cut it down and she didn't.
He has been a great support to our podcast, by the way, and it's actually he is our main source. Just want to put that out there. Anyone want to know about Judy and the Wizard of Oz, or we source John's book, we often show them. Got one here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All of you. We've known each other a long time, all of us, one way or another. And that's why this is especially a lot of fun for me, because it's just like talking with friends, except heaven help us, it's for posterity. Go.
Okay, so we're also really pleased to welcome back Paul Walsh. This is Paul's 3rd appearance on the Garland Gab, and it is our 4th collaboration with Paul overall, because we did recently appear on his A Star Is Born podcast. Part 2 it was, wasn't it, Paul?
It was, yes.
Yeah.
Again, another 2-parter with A Star Is Born. I mean, it was such a long epic that we had to split it into 2.
Yeah, if you haven't checked out his podcast, please check it out. He delves into various classic actresses like Judy, Marilyn Monroe, Joan Crawford, Betty Davis. And as always, we have Carly, Connor and Sarah, who is myself. We are all stalwarts of the Oz fandom, and we were all introduced to Judy via Oz, and we're all passionate about putting the record straight and celebrating this classic movie how it should be. Okay. So we will just start with a really brief background and history. So prior to the 1939 film, we had the book series written by L. Frank Baum, which started with The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. We had some stage productions, and we had some earlier silent films in 1908, 1910, 1914 and 1925. Thanks for the dates, John. So of all these, I've only really delved into the books that much, but does anybody have anything they want to say about anything pre-MGM Oz?
I mean, to be honest with you, I've not read any of the books except the original one. So I'm looking at John's bookshelf behind him and seeing all those volumes and thinking I've got some, I've definitely got some catching up to do. I think there's about 40 all in all you mentioned.
I think just to sum it up, when MGM decided to buy The Wizard of Oz in late 1937, early 1938, Oz was a national phenomenon here in the United States. At that point, there were, I'd have to go back and check whether we're talking 37 or 38, there were already more than 30 Oz books in print, 14 by Baum, and then the rest by Ruth Plumley Thompson, who took up the series after Baum died in 1919. And there had been the silent Oz movies. None of them have made much of a splash, and most of them are more curiosities than achievements in cinematic art. But there had been movies. There had been a stage musical in 1902 that was kind of the Cats and Phantom of the Opera and Hamilton of its day. It ran for 7 seasons, 2 companies back and forth across the United States and into Canada. It was very different than the Wizard of Oz book, even though the musical was called The Wizard of Oz. It was gunked up with vaudeville shtick and a romantic interest for Dorothy, who was a young lady and not a little girl. And because animals weren't trained for the stage back then, she went to Oz with her pet cow, Imogene, instead of her dog, Toto. It was that kind of mashup, mix-up. But all of that, the stage musical and the Oz books in particular, had been hugely successful. The books selling thousands and thousands and thousands of copies a year. And as every generation came along between 1900 and 1938, they were introduced to either the new Oz or the foundation of Oz. And so Oz, there was even an Oz national radio series in 1933 to 34 on NBC. 3 15-minute programs a week at the time when kids were coming home from school. So Oz was a very pre-sold commodity. And because nobody had ever done it successfully on the screen, that's one of the reasons that MGM jumped on it when they did. All the other studios did too, but that's for reasons you can get into as we go along.
Anything to add to that? That's a much more thorough understanding than I've ever had of the Oz books, for sure.
Well, it's greatly condensed, but that's as much as you really need. I think the important thing is that those are the reasons why Oz was such already pop culture legend. You know, the legend only went back 37, 38 years, but it was very firmly founded in popular success and acceptance. The book was regarded as America's first fairy tale because it was so American in conception. It was about a little girl from the Midwest, about a scarecrow, which everybody knew because of the great farmlands of America, a man made of tin, which was like the tin cans in the pantry that you brought home from the store. Kids knew lions as fearsome beasts in zoos or circuses or books, and a cowardly lion was a great oxymoron. So everybody kind of got into that story, and again, pre-sold success for MGM if the movie were done correctly.
I think you said it, John, in one of the documentaries. It was the Harry Potter of that time.
In terms of the books, yes, definitely. Without the, the social media hype and interconnection and all of that. No, the Wizard of Oz book sold in 1901 about 35,000 copies, which, that's word of mouth. That's people picking up that beautiful book because it was an innovation in publishing too. 24 full color plates and 100 some line drawings in 2 colors throughout the book. They weren't doing children's books that elaborately until Baum and his illustrator W.W. Denslow came along. So again, Oz was known for color. It was known for fantasy. Because of the stage show, it was known for music. And MGM, thanks to Arthur Freed and Mervyn LeRoy and Judy Garland, and Walt Disney's success with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which is part of the saga too, that all kind of coalesced and in a wonderful way.
And I actually add something too, if I can go down the route of feminism. One of the biggest reasons why I think Oz was also so groundbreaking was because it was kind of one of the first of its time that portrayed a lot of the most important protagonists as females. And I actually think I recently found out that the books were actually banned in certain areas because of how they portrayed women in power.
Baum was a great feminist. His mother-in-law, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, was right up there with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in all the women's rights movements from the 1880s, 1890s. She was a huge proponent of Indian rights. Matilda Gage was astonishing, and her daughter Maud Gage Baum, to be, was no less astonishing in her strength and in her. And Baum loved this. He used to kid his mother-in-law and she used to kid him, but there was a great rapport there. And so the fact that Oz in the books became a matriarchy, I mean, yes, Dorothy's the female heroine and her companions are men, but the antagonist and the other protagonist are the Wicked Witch and then the Good Witch of the North and the Good Witch of the South. MGM combined them into one witch, Glinda, in the movie, but they were the ones kind of in charge. And by the time Baum went back to writing more Oz books on demand, as it were, because of the success of the first one, he brought in Princess Ozma, the rightful ruler of Oz, at the end of the second book. And from then on, she and Glinda really held sway over the country, plus Dorothy coming back to visit and eventually settling in Oz. Baum was great with female heroines, and he had two other little girls from America eventually come to Oz. When Ruth Thompson took over this series, she had little boys from America come to Oz. So just to balance it all. But that's a great point, Carly. And I remember vividly, because it was in the 1980s that Oz ran into sociological trouble with book banning. And it was, surprise, surprise, the religious right that insisted that the Oz books and the Oz plays should not be encouraged or kept in school libraries or performed by schools, because Baum writes about the fact that there are good witches, and everybody knows, according to the Bible, there can be no such thing as a good witch. And Baum has talking animals, and this gives animals a right that God never gave them. I guess they're forgetting the snake in the Garden of Eden, or maybe that was their point. I don't know, but it was just the same old. Forgive me, as a being a good Christian man, which I in the Lutheran Church all my life. I'm in the very liberal, embracing all Lutheran Church, and all of the religious right stuff just seems to me so anti-Christian that. The fact that it would take off on Oz is an excellent point, Carly. Thank you very much.
I think one of the things I wanted to add, and this was probably more of a question actually, around, why, because it was such a phenomenon, like you said at the beginning of the century, why do you think it kind of lost a bit of steam and perhaps isn't as well remembered or aren't as well remembered at this point, as popular as they were at the beginning of the century? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think first of all, that was an innovative book. As a fairy tale, it was American. It wasn't the Grimm brothers or Hans Andersen or Alice in Wonderland, which were the decades, centuries old things that children read or had read to them. So I think that was part of it. Again, the fact that the Oz book, the first Oz books and the successive Oz books were colorful and illustrated throughout was a great factor. And because they got to be, like the Harry Potter books, kind of a family reunion. Every Christmas there was a new Oz book. And if you started reading when I was a kid, there are letters to Baum that are extant where people are saying, oh, I've been reading the Oz book since I was a little girl. Now I'm in my 20s. Now I'm married and I read them to my kids. Now I'm a grandparent and my wife and I enjoy your books and sharing your books. They're very entertaining. I think that's one of the points that I always make when I do a presentation about the movie, is that Frank Baum, as a writer, as a spokesman, as a theatrical, he was a born entertainer. He communicated. He had a charisma. One of the few people I was privileged to meet in the 1980s was the first screen Dorothy, who played Dorothy in Baum's 1908 Oz movies. And she did personal appearances with him. And these movies were part of a stage show where he was on stage narrating the films as they went on. And she said he had an amazing rapport with the audience. You could feel it when he walked on stage. There was a magnetism, not unlike the kind of thing we always hear about Judy. So, and I think that translated to his books too. Some of the Oz intellectuals, and I say that affectionately and gratefully, pointed out, no, the Oz books are not stylistically great or carefully well written. They aren't lavish in their language, but what they are is three-dimensional. And when you open an Oz book and start reading, especially as a kid, you don't read, you go right into the page and you go on the adventures with the characters, the protagonist, and all the crazies that surround them in and out of Oz. The fact that then 22 years after the book was published, Judy Garland was born with immeasurable charisma and communicative power, and ended up being the centerpiece of that movie. Ensured she was, we know, the world's greatest entertainer. That translated on screen as well. And MGM was the biggest playground for adults in the 30s and 40s that ever existed. They got the best people and let them loose, hang the cost, and just do it. What does Debbie Reynolds say in That's Entertainment? Do any of you remember that quote? Do it big, do it right, and give it class, something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Okay, well, there it is. And they did. I don't think there's any other studio in Hollywood in 38, 39, no matter how much they were all thriving. I don't think any other studio in Hollywood would have gambled the investment that MGM put into Oz, built around a girl who had done 6 supporting and featured films, but they believed in her. They believed in the power of the story. And MGM, Baum, and Judy Garland were all in the entertainment business. And when those 3 things coalesced, we got the movie that I still talk about too much today.
Well, speaking of MGM, we'll move on now to MGM and the pre-production. So I believe it was Arthur Freed was wanting to produce movies. He'd been a songwriter at this point, and he really wanted to work with Judy. And he suggested, he wanted to produce The Wizard of Oz with Judy. So the contracts were signed on the 2nd of June, is that right?
Yes, and the announcement formally was made on June 3rd, but it had already been announced in February that a deal with Goldwyn, Sam Goldwyn bought the rights from the Baum family to make The Wizard of Oz in 1933. He was going to do it as a musical, as the stage musical had been, but he wanted Moss Hart, the great playwright, to do the script, and Irving Berlin to do the songs. And Irving Berlin said no, and Moss said, well, if Irving won't do it, I won't do it. Meanwhile, Eddie Cantor, who was to play, depending on which press release you read, either the Scarecrow or the Wizard, was kind of losing popularity by the time they could have gotten around to doing it. He was still making films for Goldwyn, but they weren't the success they had been earlier in the 30s. And so Goldwyn was happy to sell the rights to MGM when they wanted them. The crazy thing is that, Freed was a songwriter at MGM. For anybody who might not know, he was the lyricist of You Are My Lucky Star, Broadway Rhythm, Broadway Melody, but he wanted to produce, as Sarah said. And with the success Judy had in Broadway Melody of 1938, it was in theaters in 1937 in the fall. That's when he went to Louis B. Mayer and said, I want to produce, I want to try and find something for Judy, because the exact quote is, he said to Mayer, they love the kid. They love the kid, meaning Judy and Broadway Melody. And Mayer said, go ahead and find a property. Well, Oz was a logical choice. And then in December 1937, Walt Disney opened Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, feature-length musical fantasy cartoon. And because that was a blowout success instantly, by January 38, all the studios, or a number of the studios, were bidding against each other to get the rights for Oz from Samuel Goldwyn. But Arthur was there first, and MGM kept upping the ante. The money people in New York, Nick Skank at Lowe's Incorporated, which owned the theater chain and owned MGM, they were appalled that MGM was offering this much money for The Wizard of Oz. Goldwyn had paid $40,000 for it in 1932, 33. MGM finally upped it to, they could pay him $75,000. So he was making almost 100% profit on what he had put into it. But they wanted it for Judy. 20th Century Fox desperately wanted it for Shirley Temple, but MGM outbid them. And MGM was MGM. We hear about Fox, we hear about Paramount, we hear about Warner Brothers. They were all big and glorious and successful, and Goldwyn. But MGM had that supremacy. It's why people talk about MGM the way they do to this day. They went ahead and got it, and they bought it for Judy Garland.
Brings me perfectly to my next point, is that the project was purchased specifically for Judy. We're going to do our first myth bust. Shirley Temple was not the first choice for Dorothy. Carly, you were discussing this the other day. Do you want to take us through this?
I can if you like. I mean, really, the Shirley Temple was only very briefly considered, right? It was only like 1 or 2 days of consideration. And the only reason was because it was a lot of money and it was a huge project. It was a huge gamble. And Nick, is it Schenk? Nick Schenk or?
Pronounced
okay.
Schenk. Yeah.
And he wanted them to at least test Shirley Temple because they wanted a name. They wanted a name with someone who was big at the box office to ensure that this movie would be successful. And that is about the length of it. Roger Edens, I think, went over and tested Shirley Temple, and she didn't have the singing chops anyway. And he was pretty much forced into going to listen to her sing. He didn't want to go, and she didn't have the chops for it, and Fox wouldn't loan her out anyway. So it was case closed. Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg had also already been assigned for the music. And before a cast list was even finalized, they were writing all of the lyrics and all of the music specifically for Judy as their Dorothy.
You can imagine why the money men would have looked at the cost that they're paying and then look at Shirley, who's obviously the biggest child star at that time, and thought, okay, let's try and make this work. But obviously, I don't imagine it took long for them to realize it perhaps wasn't going to be the best fit.
Part as well is because they wanted Shirley Temple for insurance, because it was very expensive. But by the time Wizard of Oz was released and then Judy was catapulted into superstardom, Shirley Temple's star was starting to decline. So
yeah,
people are always, wondering if Shirley Temple had have played Dorothy, she wouldn't have been able to sing Over the Rainbow. But it wasn't actually written by that point, and it was highly unlikely that it would have been written.
Well, actually, no, that was one thing that Carly said, and I don't mean to contradict you, but all of this casting stuff was going on December, January, February, March, April of 1937 to 38. Arlen and Harburg weren't brought into the project till the end of April, and they didn't start working till May. So it wasn't, the cast was pretty well set, at least for Judy and Ray and Buddy Ebsen as the Tin Man. It was through Yip Harburg and Harold Arlen's encouragement that Burt Lahr was brought in to play the Cowardly Lion, because they had worked with him on Broadway. But those songs were all kind of written from spring into the summer of 1938. The point you made, Carly, that is the most important though, is that, and you underscored this, the songs were written for Judy Garland. The Jitterbug was the first thing they wrote, and that was for Judy's simply swell sense of swing, as some reviewer put it back in the day, and then ultimately Over the Rainbow, which was pretty much the last big thing they wrote for the film. Ballads, Harold Arlen always said, are the ones that are difficult to find a melody that will flow, and but there's no question that they wrote the score for Judy Garland, but basically for the other cast members too. And they had worked with Ray Bolger on Broadway as well. So there was a great, the New York Hollywood pools of talent were very coalescent, if there is such a word, at that point. And that's another reason it worked so well. And I think that's why Arthur fought to get Yip and Harold Arlen the job.
Yeah, I can't imagine On the Good Ship Lollipop washing as well in the opening scene, so it probably worked out for the best.
Okay, so we've mentioned Arthur Frees, but the final producer did become Mervyn LeRoy. Arthur Freed became associate producer. This is another thing where there's quite a bit of confusion around it. So does anybody want to take us through this?
Irving Thalberg, who was the bright genius of MGM, had died in I think it was 1937. It might have been 1930. Somebody can Google that. But Mayer was under pressure, again, from the New York money to bring in another Thalberg who would do the kind of classy projects that Thalberg did and, you know, contribute so much creatively to MGM. And Mayer had sought Mervyn LeRoy, who had been a very successful director through the 30s at Warner Brothers. And Mervyn LeRoy was romanced to come to MGM starting in mid to late 1937 at an unheard of salary that was being kept private so as not to raise too much ire among other producers. You know, when Mervyn was in talks to come to MGM, Arthur was in negotiations, early negotiations to secure Wizard of Oz for Judy. Arthur loved the Oz books. Again, they were all of an age. Arthur and Mervyn were of an age where they would have grown up with the Oz books and even the touring musical between 1902 and 1909. So they loved Oz. And, but again, when Mervyn came in and he started the first week of February, 1938, when, you know, Oz was pretty much already MGM's baby, not officially, but yes, it looked that way. And Mayer said, this is going to be too expensive a proposition, Arthur, for you to take on as a first movie. We're going to let Mervyn do it, even though Mervyn only had one musical to his credit in all the years at Warner Brothers. I think it was one of the Gold Diggers pictures. But Mervyn will produce and you will learn the production ropes assisting Mervyn LeRoy. And Arthur, it was a bitter pill for Arthur, but he knew, no, that this is important. This is training. I will do this. Because Mervyn, you know, now there is some controversy. Well, we know that Arthur did a lot, but that's only because his papers survive and Mervyn LeRoy's papers and the production files don't survive. And that's true. But Mervyn LeRoy, between February and 38 and the end of the year, was in production on 2 other movies and pre-production on a 3rd. He wasn't just doing Wizard of Oz. So a lot of everything fell to Arthur Freed, you know, overseeing costume concept. Mervyn, of course, had to sign off on all of this, but Arthur worked on the music. Arthur worked with Roger in the music department. He worked with the actors. It was he who suggested casting Judy and Ray and Buddy Ebsen and Frank Morgan way back in January of 38. So Mervyn LeRoy deserves the credit for fighting for Wizard of Oz, because there were at least 3 times between early 38 and late 38 when Nick Skank tried to shut the production down, tried to cancel the production. Arthur did not have the clout to fight for Oz at that point. Mervyn LeRoy did because of his position at MGM. They both contributed enormously to the film in their own ways. I think that's safest to leave it at that.
Yeah. It's just, I wanted to bring it up because it's one of those things, like many things with Oz, is depends on which book you read, you get about 10 different versions of what actually happened. And, you know, there's been some who've suggested that Mervyn LeRoy suggested making it with Judy, but we know it was initially Arthur Freed. So just wanted to clarify that.
Well, Mervyn LeRoy certainly didn't have any objections to Judy. The only objections to Judy came from the front office in New York. And they only objected because, as Paul has said, Connor, Carly, all of you said, Shirley Temple was box office. She'd been the biggest star in America for 4 years. And if anybody was going to invest $1.2 million in a Technicolor movie musical about a little girl, you didn't think of Marjorie Main, you didn't think of Greer Garson, you didn't think of Deanna Durbin either. A little girl was Shirley Temple. So, but no, Mervyn was always said, you know, he said, I fell in love with Judy when I saw her in Pigskin Parade, her first feature film in 1936. And he said, you know, she had all the qualities of Dorothy. I think it's very important. The trouble is there's so much written history about the Wizard of Oz movie, perhaps more than any other film, or as much as. And so much of it is conflated and convoluted, and they make grandiose statements built on something that happened here but wasn't reported till then, or that was reported then but really happened then, or it wasn't actuality. And unless you go literally day by day as best you you can't put together the mosaic of the Wizard of Oz. I think that's what I and several other authors and several documentarians have tried to do over the years, because it's a fascinating, I always say, I was lucky to work on the Life with Judy Garland TV movie, Me and My Shadows, based on Lorna's book. And I've got a stack of scripts, very tall stack of scripts that they sent me, and then I would annotate and send to them, and then I requested they send them back because of course I wanted to have them. But I would cross out pages of script and in the margin just write, the truth is more interesting. The truth is more interesting. Because again, the writers were very good, but they would go off on these flights of fancy, or they'd base them on information that wasn't exactly correct. And I think in the case of Oz, and this is something that all four of you have invested in the plans for this particular podcast, the fact that there is so much, as Judy said, so much, Judy once said, there's been so much hooey printed about my life. Well, Wizard of Oz is foremost there, and now it's being discussed even more. I've decided to go on a diet of coffee and cigarettes and benzocaine. I didn't start before today. I'd be even more hypermatic, but it's just.
It's such a pity, because you talk about we'll say how the Oz is portrayed in Me and My Shadows, which is, okay, it's condensed, but it's pretty much exactly as it should be, as it shows that they come in and we bought Wizard of Oz for you, yay. And then there's a little brief mention of Shirley, and then it's back to Judy, yay. Whereas the other recent film opens with, oh, well, we've just heard Shirley Temple sing, so let's see how Judy does. And it's fueling the fire. It's just such a pity someone like you wasn't consulted on a lot of things like that, because that's just fueling the myths in such a big way.
I think that was their point in not consulting anybody. Whom they should have consulted was Lorna Smith and bought the rights to her book.
Yes.
Again, the truth is more interesting. You could tell the most heartbreaking, uplifting, glorious, heart-tearing story of Judy Garland from the end of 1968 into 1969 by just telling the truth.
Well, that's one of the main reasons why we're doing this podcast, right? And especially now in this era of social media, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, everyone's opinion is out there. And if they run with a little piece of information, they run with it. And they will take that little nugget of untrue information, they won't look any further into it, and they'll write off the movie completely. I've seen so many comments of people saying they will not watch The Wizard of Oz anymore because of what the Munchkins apparently did to Judy, and because of what they put her through, and all this other stuff. And it drives me into a blind rage when I see that. But I'm hoping at the end of the day that this podcast falls into the right hands and people actually watch it and understand the true story of a beloved classic.
What's so interesting to me is that if you go back to the 50th anniversary documentary with Angela Lansbury, and they show 2 clips of Judy on the Jack Parr show telling stories about the Wizard of Oz, it's set up with Liza and Lorna talking about that Judy liked a good story a little bit more than the truth at times, and it concludes with Angela Lansbury saying another tall tale by Judy Garland.
Our mother had an amazing sense of humor, and anybody who really knew her knew what a funny, bright, witty raconteur she was, and her vocabulary was immense, and she had a way of telling a story. She could change anything. So anything that she talked about would become an epic joke almost. And we used to love to listen to her. And she did that several times, telling stories about the Wizard of Oz. And they have since passed into myth. I mean, people believe a lot of the things that she has told, which in fact, we know are not true.
You know, it's setting the scene that, okay, not everything that is said is going to be necessarily true, you know, but we don't have that today.
Well, and I think, you know, Jack Haley Jr., who produced that documentary, has to take some of the blame for including that material. But then again, I don't think either of the tales as she told them were exaggerated. I think those things basically happened. There was even at the time, there was stuff in the columns that I think it was Billy Curtis couldn't understand why Judy Garland wouldn't go out with him because she preferred Jackie Cooper, and Billy thinks, you know, he can't understand why she'd be interested in a shallow, callow youth as opposed to a man. I don't know. Yeah, but again, this was grist for the mill, and it's very easy to see. Which again, the scene they used in Life with Judy Garland, Fleming up on it, Victor Fleming, the director, up on his boom, telling the three gentlemen,
"Hold it, you three dirty hands! Let that little girl in there."
Because if you watch after they met Bert Lahr, there's the shot from the rear as they're going out of the forest. And the Yellow Brick Road is so comparatively narrow, and the bulk of the costumes, especially the lion and the Tin Man, are such that to stay on the Yellow Brick Road while kicking off a little bit to the side and doing the dance step, they have to scrunch in. And when they go off down the Yellow Brick Road, they have scrunched into the effect that you just see a sliver of Judy in between them from behind. And it's entirely possible that the same thing happened when they were coming down the Yellow Brick Road in rehearsal or in the first take or the second take, and Fleming saying, you know, come on, you bozos, you know, you've got to concentrate on leaving space for Judy, on not, and there was no malice to it. Judy never told it with malice. Algene Harmetz in her book, you know, talks about how Judy told this story bitterly on national television. There wasn't anything bitter about Judy Garland publicly, ever. And it was all good humor. And sorry, but again, the perspective is so important. And as Carly has just said, all of this stuff gets put forward by people. I have found that the people who make those comments and ascribe to the comments that, you know, the gossip and the rumor, that tells us always much more about those people than it does about the Wizard of Oz or about, and unfortunately, there are more and more. I don't mean to sound like an old poop, but I'm 71. I have earned old poop status. There are more and more and more of those people all the time, it seems, and they make more noise than anybody else, unfortunately. So again, this is why I have been fascinated by the Garland Gab since you guys started it and started waving the flag and saying, no, we're here for truth, justice, and the Judy Garland way of the world. And enough.
Those things we've just discussed, we'll discuss them in more detail as we're going through the actual, you know, scenes. But one, we're in the day of cancel culture, which doesn't help. So people will cancel anything for anything. And this is coming from someone who's also quite liberal as well. But, you know, there is a limit. And two, we've got, 527 subscribers now, which is, we're doing really well, you know, we're nearly, you know, a year old. We're doing quite nice. We're happy with what we're doing. But a lot of YouTubers, you know, are viral. They're like in the millions, and you've got someone like Cracked. Don't know whether you've heard of that channel, John. This is like a channel for a reason. And they had, I shared it with the guys in our chat, and I was absolutely fuming, and they were like, Sarah, calm down, calm down. They had a big headline, Judy Garland was addicted to methamphetamine during the Wizard of Oz. Now, methamphetamine wasn't even around until the 1940s, and when I argued, they're like, yeah, but it was still a form of amphetamine. And I was like, you don't understand. In those days, yet she was given these pills to help her lose weight, sleeping pills, then more to wake her up. it was wrong. It's horrible. It's horrible what happens in that sense. But as you said, we need perspective. These were prescribed by a doctor. They didn't know how bad they would be or how addictive. Yeah, it's horrific that a young girl is, you know, going through this. But they just didn't know. Do you know?
Can I just hop in over that, Sarah, for 1 second? Because another thing that all those videos say is, like, you know, so when she was making The Wizard of Oz, she had, you know, diet of black coffee, 80 cigarettes a day, diet pills, energy pills, sleeping pills, more pills. I'm like, oh, how many pills was she supposed to be taking here? Like, can we, like, relax? It was amphetamine and sleeping pills. Like, that was it.
And pockets in the dress as well. That's the funniest
The
one. She
cigarettes.
had her pockets in the gown to hold her 80 cigarettes. So,
Yeah.
you know.
It's like, seriously, stop and think about it for a second. You really think a 16-year-old girl is doing all of this while making a movie?
From the time there were cigarettes, you know, smoking cigarettes was supposed to be, at least until the 1960s, when all the cancer information was posted. Smoking cigarettes was supposed to be a mark of you were an adult. If you were an adult, if you could smoke a cigarette. And the average teen couldn't wait to smoke a cigarette, especially if you were an average teen in the sophisticated world of show business. I think Judy probably sneaked cigarettes when she was possibly 15 or 16 or 17. I think the first picture of her holding a cigarette is from 1941 when she's in a costume test for Babes on Broadway. She would have been 19 then and entitled. I don't think she was smoking much at all at the time of Wizard of Oz. There's no proof of it because I think there were so many people alive when Judy died who had worked with her and who had been in the Wizard of Oz and who were interviewed by Gerald Frank and Christopher Finch and people like that for the early biographies. And one of the points that is made over and over by her co-stars, you know, Jack Haley came up point blank in 1970 and said, Judy wasn't on pills during the Wizard of Oz. That happened later. Gerald Frank says that Judy was so overjoyed from everybody with whom he spoke, overjoyed at being in this production. Because again, you have to remember, Pigskin Parade, Broadway Melody, Andy Hardy, Everybody Sing, only Everybody Sing was really built around her. And she had a lot of support then too. To be cast in the pivotal role of a 1.2, 1.7, 2.2, 2.7, 3.2, 3.7 musical was extraordinary. And she knew that, and she was absolutely overjoyed about it. So she wasn't requiring, she was fraught with natural energy. Everybody who talks about Judy said that was one of her great, she had great physical energy. She had great emotional energy. She would give so much of it that it would sap her strength at times, but she gave it and it was there to call upon. I go beyond that now. And I think about the fact that, you know, they all say no, that this wasn't artificial. This was her own joy. They talk about the fact too, that at that point, because she was underage, she could only be on the set, camera on the set, rehearsal on the set, 4 hours of any of the 6 days a week she worked. The other 3 hours in school, other hour of recreation. What passed for recreation at 1938 MGM, I don't think I want to know, but you know, calisthenics, who knows? But it was to the point where then they knew that they could only use her a certain amount of time on the lot. So that's when they were sending the makeup and the hair people to her home at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning to make her up as Dorothy, so that when she drove through the gate and the day officially started, they could use her optimally. So that's, you know, and as far as food is concerned, one thing that, you know, you always hear, oh, Judy and her weight, Judy and her weight, chicken soup in the commissary. That may be, but of all the films she did, the early films, I don't think there's one where she looks quite as thick-waisted in any of them as she does in that blue and white dress in The Wizard of Oz. This is not a wraith. This is, as even Newsweek said, a rather more buxom Dorothy than in W.W. Denslow's illustrations in the book. This is a girl who is eating. And if not at MGM, then at home. And I knew Baum family members in later years. And one of them, L. Frank Baum's granddaughter, Florence, was, I believe, 14 when Judy was making The Wizard of Oz. And as a Baum family member, she was given certain access to the set when she could get away from school. And she and Judy kind of palled around. They were bosom companions. Florence wasn't there enough. And Judy was certainly older and more sophisticated in some ways than the average 14-year-old. But Florence went on record as saying, I was her slave. I would do anything she asked me to do. And one of the things that she asked Florence to do was go to the commissary, because Judy couldn't order this and get away with it, go to the commissary and order a double order of mashed potatoes and gravy and bring it back to Judy's dressing room. The girl was eating. She was not smoking that much. And at that point, according to everybody who knew her, she did not need much, if much, in the way of prescription medication. These are the facts, folks, from people who were there long before there was this mad, passionate, let's dissect every dark cloud that overhangs everything in the world and put doom and gloom, especially on the things that have made people happy. As I say, it says something about the people who do that or want to do that or are desperate to do that than it does about any of the truisms of Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, and there's one thing I was going to add as well, and just a short bit, in terms of the practicalities of smoking that many cigarettes on a set that hot with a man made of straw in a cornfield. I don't necessarily know if that was the safest option either.
Not to mention 80 cigarettes a day is one every 15 minutes if you don't sleep. There's absolutely no way like that would ever happen.
It's hard to be lighting one off, off the end of the other one. Like, you just...
I'll go back to the Munchkins for just a minute, because of course that started from Judy's carefree anecdote on the Jack Parr show on a night when she was not in great shape, but she was funny, true to her tradition, and she was being funny. She was there to be funny. Those comments have been misquoted and misprinted and draped in crepe and all the rest of it. Then dear beloved, kindly, sweet, wholesome Sid Luft in his memoirs, or as they were rewritten by his henchmen, elaborated on them. And then the Yellow Press, isn't the Daily Mail one of the most pluralist of all? They picked up on it and expanded even more so. And the Munchkins, I ended up knowing close to 20 of the original Munchkins in person between 1989 and when the last one passed. And I would say a dozen of them got to be good friends, and with whom I was able to spend most of the time. And they swore by Judy Garland. They loved her. Nobody would have let Munchkin gentlemen bother, never mind molest, a 16-year-old girl on the set. There was no such thing going on. It's preposterous, and it's disgusting to think that people would assume that this could be pasted onto their behavior back then. Yes, of the 124 little people, there were 8 or 10 or 12 who were partiers, but that was off the set and late at night. And unfortunately, their reputation has then impacted on everybody else of the Munchkin troupe. But no, Judy never said they fondled my skirt, the hem of my skirt. Judy never said they backed me into a corner. Judy said that one of them asked her to dinner. That's as far as it went. And she did say that they were drunks, and that was a misstep on her part, but she was going for the laugh. And if she'd said that some of them were drunks, she would have been 100% accurate. And we know those stories because the ones who were there are not unwilling to tell them, but just to put percentage to the ridiculous stories that came out after. It's a good thing that most of the Munchkins, I forget what year Sid's book was published, but it's a good thing that most, if not all, of the Munchkins were gone by then, or there would have been a real Munchkin insurrection in defense of themselves and in defense of Judy. And in defense that anybody, Victor Fleming, the assistant director, the gaffers, the electricians, the spotlight people, the guys on the catwalk, if they'd seen anything like that going on, there would have been hell to pay. And the little people would have been out of there the next day, the little people involved. There's an existing memo. It's in the 50th anniversary book that, you know, a couple of the Munchkins had been dismissed for rowdy behavior, but that had nothing to do with Judy Garland. There were troubles with the Munchkins, but nobody ever said, oh, there were troubles with the Munchkins and Dorothy.
We were just then just on the, you know, like cigarettes, coffee, diet pills myth. I mean, it's documented quite a lot, as you've just said, that Judy was very good at sneaking food. What was her actual coffee habit? Because that's another one that pops up, and I hardly ever see Judy with a cup of coffee in pictures or anything.
I think she would be more likely to have a Coca-Cola than a cup of coffee. And again, nobody knew, everybody, again, I don't know the crime. I don't think coffee was her drink of choice at 16 yet. She may have had it occasionally, but she'd more likely go to Coke. You know, or milk, for heaven's sakes. You know, you often see her with a glass of milk at lunch at MGM. And if anybody, she said, can I get a cup of coffee? I'm sure they would have brought it to her. They didn't feed her coffee intravenously. They didn't say, honey, you're dragging, pick it up. All they had to say was action, and she was present. We all know that Bobby Cochet, thanks to Al Jean's book, which has some wonderful stuff in it, apart from some of the other stuff in it, but Al Jean talked to so many people, and Bobby Cochet was Judy Garland's double and primary stand-in. But Karen Marsh-Dahl, who had known Judy for several years at that point, because Karen had an older sister who had danced in, I think, Pigskin Parade and brought Judy over to the house. Karen is just Judy's age, and she was working in film. No, Karen is 3 years older than Judy, pardon me. So Karen was working legally in film as a dancer in 37, 38, 39. And she had been at MGM on pictures, and they said, we need somebody else to stand in for Judy Garland, not double, but stand in to test the lights and the camera angles and all this kind of stuff. And Karen did several scenes like that. But she said what she remembered several things, you know, the huge Technicolor camera, the great technical problems there were in moving it and lighting this and getting enough light for Technicolor, which was so hot that they had to stop filming every so often and open the soundstage doors and let in cool air. There was a fireman specialist with a heat meter holding it up to the thatched roofs of Munchkin Land and saying, no, you've got to turn out the lights. These thatched roofs are in danger of catching on fire now. So Karen would go through all that. And she said one of the things she primarily remembers, apart from being on the Yellow Brick Road, she remembers testing the Kansas scenes with the wind machines as Dorothy is trying to advance down the road and get home while the tornado is coming. And she said those wind machines were blowing hard, and they were blowing dust, and they were blowing twigs, and they were blowing leaves and small branches and all that kind of stuff. And I did it, and I did it, and I did it until they pretty much knew what they had. And then they brought Judy back from her little tent over on the side or outside or wherever it was, where she was putting in her requisite hours of schooling. And they said, okay, now, Karen, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, but they said to Karen, all right, Judy, watch, Karen's going to do what we want you to do. And Judy watched Karen do it once. And this is Legion with Judy Garland. She had dance-ins, she had stand-ins. They were taught the stuff. Judy watched them do it, and then Judy went in and nailed it. So and you cannot be medicated, you cannot be high on coffee or pills, you cannot be coughing up a lung on cigarettes if you're going to do all of the stuff that she did. I'm sorry. I hate to blow the purely heinous legend, but it's important. I think one reason that this podcast is so important is that your stated thesis was to blow some of this garbage out of the water and say, sorry, folks, you want to be negative and you want to be gossipy, take it someplace else. Okay,
just still in pre-production, so I'm just going to whiz through the 5 directors that worked on the film. Not in loads of detail, but we had Norman Torog, who did tests. Then Richard Thorpe commenced shooting until his footage was deemed unusable. Then George Cukor oversaw key changes and played a small but vital role in the film's success. Then Victor Fleming came on board He is the credited director and he oversaw most of the production. Then King Vidor came uncredited. He finished off the film when Victor Fleming was summoned to work on Gone with the Wind. He oversaw all the Kansas scenes, including Over the Rainbow, which he stated he didn't want any credit for. He was friends with Victor Fleming. And then I'll just whiz through the cast and everything, and then we'll have a little discussion on that, and then we'll go through production. So Buddy Ebsen was originally cast as the Scarecrow and Ray Bolger the Tin Man. But the roles were swapped because Ray Bolger has always envisioned himself as the Scarecrow, especially with the dance moves he could do. But after Buddy Ebsen's accident, which we'll get through in the production, he was replaced with Jack Haley. Burt Law cast as Cowardly Lion. There was Gail Sondergaard was cast as the Wicked Witch of the West, and she was initially designed to be glamorous, like Snow White's evil queen. And then when they were reminded, you know, bad witches are ugly, they gave her the ugly treatment, and she was horrified. So then they brought in Margaret Hamilton. I think earlier concept had Edna May Oliver as a cantankerous wicked, but also somewhat comical Wicked Witch of the West. Fanny Bryce B. Lilly, also Helen Gilbert considered for Glinda. Billy Burke, who was worked with Judy and Everybody Sing, was cast. Frank Morgan cast as the Wizard, also Professor Marvel, Doorman, Cabby and the Guard. And Edwin and W.C. Fields were also considered. Various actors have tested for Auntie M, including Sarah Paddon, May Robson. Clara Blanda was given the role. Charlie Greatman cast as Uncle Henry. And the singer, not singing midgets as I wrote, cast as the Munchkins, along with some others and some children. And finally, Judy Garland was cast as Dorothy Gale, whoever that is. As we've mentioned, we've got Harold Darwin, E.Y. Yipar assigned to write the songs, Adrian costumes, Jack Dunn makeup, Buddy Gillespie special effects, and then we have Noel Langley, which I haven't written, and who adapted it to the screen, and I've forgotten the other two who worked on the script. John.
Oh, who did
Florence
the script?
Ryerson.
Noel Langley. Well, there were like 15 people who worked on the script one way or another, but Noel Langley was the one whose adaptation was taken as is, and then they brought in Florence Ryerson and Edgar Allan Wolfe to refine that, and then they brought Langley back to re-refine what they had done, and they're the three writers of credit: Langley, Ryerson, and Wolfe.
And they that's the bulk of the main, crew behind the Wizard of Oz and the talent that went into it. Any opinions on any of that? You don't have to go into a lot of detail because, again, we can discuss it in the scene by scene analysis, like the special effects and everything, the changes from the book to the script. I know Connor wants to make a point about the ruby slippers, but anything? Anybody?
I think it's interesting with Norman Torog, obviously, who would then direct Judy and present in Lily Mars, and I believe Girl Crazy as well. Obviously after he replaced Busby Berkeley. So that was an interesting connection that I wasn't actually aware of until I did my podcast episode on presenting Lily Mars. But for me, Richard Thorpe's Oz, I've always been quite fascinated just looking at the stills that we have, mainly because I just was seeing Judy as a blonde. Not quite sure how that would have looked, but it could have been a really different film had he been allowed to continue. I'm not quite sure why his footage was deemed quote unquote unusable. I'm not sure whether they just decided that wasn't the vision that they had for the film. John, you might have a bit more information on that. Well,
I'll start with the blonde business. In the first Oz book, for which Denslow drew the pictures, Dorothy's about 6, 7, maybe somewhere between 6 and 8 years old. But her age is never given in the book, and she has the brown pigtails. That's the image of Dorothy. And Denslow's illustrations were the only illustrations in the Wizard of Oz book from 1900 into the 1940s. They were not the Wizard of Oz story. If you bought that story, except for a couple minor little movie related editions, that's what Dorothy always looked like. But starting when Dorothy goes back in the third Oz book, from 1907 on, Dorothy is pictured by the next artist as a blonde, and a blonde with short hair. So I think Metro was trying to meld the two, give her the braids, but let her be a blonde. And Ruth Thompson, who was writing the Oz books when the MGM movie was going on, said she was getting letters from kids who wrote to her about Oz all the time and about the Oz books, who were very upset that Judy Garland was playing Dorothy because Judy Garland wasn't a blonde. So there may have been some reason for them going blonde in that direction too. The trouble with Thorpe's footage, it was kind of like what George Cukor once defined as the firm touch on the wrong note. They went barreling ahead thinking they had it down, you know, they had solved the makeup problems and the costume problems. But you look at the Yellow Brick Road and it's got these odd oval shaped patio furniture kind of bricks. The cornfield is in bad shape. The Wicked Witch's hair is down and kind of a Leah Michele on Glee flip. Decades before Leah Michele. It was just all odd. Dorothy's big frilly dress. This is not a dress a girl would wear on a Kansas farm, maybe once a year to go to a birthday party, but not in farm life. And I know they were trying to make Judy pretty. You know, that was always their goal at MGM, when they didn't realize that just make her look like Judy Garland and she's going to be pretty enough for anybody. So there was all of that. Plus, evidently, Thorpe was directing it in a fairy tale kind of unreal sort of way. You know, Judy was acting kind of like I don't know, because we have no footage. We don't know. The pre-recordings sound the same. The breakdown in the Witch's Castle version of Over the Rainbow, she sounds just like Judy Garland as Dorothy Gale. But evidently, the reality of her heart and soul and her playing were being painted over that was all of the makeup and the affectation. Let's say it was that. And the other actors were being directed in a way, you know, Margaret Hamilton remembers vividly that after about a week and a half, maybe 8-10 days of shooting, all the principals were called into Mervyn LeRoy's office and he read them the riot act. What are you doing? You're ruining the picture. Da, 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 da. And Ebsen and Margaret Hamilton said later, we didn't know what he was talking about because we were just doing as we were directed. So evidently, just all very kind of maybe fairy tale. Oh, Dorothy, you know, very false. They weren't being real, and showed. And Thorpe was fired at the time that Buddy Ebsen was ill from his ingesting the silver dust, the aluminum dust in his makeup, and. That's why Thorpe left.
I did read that there was a news article at the time, and again I'm paraphrasing, that Judy actually said, you know, the blonde wig made me act differently, and I was thinking that might have been something more to do with the direction as opposed to the actual wig on your head. But yeah, I imagine it was a little bit more pantomiming as opposed to what we actually ended up with.
I just, from what you said, Paul, I can tie into something. Have you guys seen that silent footage of Judy on the lot at MGM, where it's just like 15 seconds long, where she's outdoors and she's in the blonde wig and in the fuller dress, and somebody catches her as she's going over to a crowd who are watching something happen, and she turns around and does a little kind of Princess Grace Cinderella curtsy, and it's like, well, if that's how she was acting as Dorothy, no. I mean, when she meets Billy Burke and does her little, you know, you can't see her foot, but you get the sense from her body language that one foot is going behind the other and she's doing a little bit of a nod, but she's not doing, you know, my name is Aurora, but you can call me Sleeping Beauty sort of act.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah.
So we'll move on to a little bit about the production. Not too much. Again, this is another thing that pops up. Wizard of Oz's production was as dramatic as the film itself. Yeah, it actually was quite dramatic, but not for, you know, the reasons they say. But we've just discussed this. Richard Thorpe commences filming and he starts with the Scarecrow scenes and also does some scenes in the Wicked Witch's Castle. But Mervyn LeRoy is not happy with what is being produced, and he shuts down production. And two vital things happen in this case. One, George Cukor is due to work on Gone with the Wind, so he can't oversee the whole production, but he comes and views some footage and he makes some vital contributions. George Cukor, who would go on and direct Judy and the Star is Born. Almost directors are Meet Me in St. Louis. He's the one who suggests getting rid of the curly blonde wig, bringing the pigtails, different dress, different makeup, more natural makeup, so we now see Judy Garland in all her beauty, despite what people say, and reminds her to be herself and that she is just a little girl from Kansas. And also, during this is when Buddy Ebsen has a reaction to the aluminum dust that is being used on his face for his Tin Man makeup, and he spends some time quite ill in an iron lung, especially considering the time period as well. And Jack Haley is brought in. He does 3 days of filming before they realise that his Tin Man outfit's too shiny, because this is before the brush and co scene, and so they have to reshoot to make his outfit dirty. But I want to say one thing. I mean, I was going to bring this in on the actual scene, but I'm jumping ahead now. I love, he mentions about getting his voice, you know, for the Tin Man. When I was a kid, except for Dorothy, everyone loved the Scarecrow, everyone loved the Cowardly Lion because they were funny. The Tin Man was my favourite out of the three friends because I just loved his voice. Absolutely loved it. It just relaxed me. I thought, oh, it was so lovely. Sorry, I just want to point that out. And now I'll shut up again. And is anything anyone wants to say about the production and these very important events that happened?
I, for one, am in complete agreement with you, Sarah. Jack Haley, the Tin Man, was always my favorite of her three friends, specifically because of his voice. He is just the sweetest. And If I Only Had a Heart, aside from Over the Rainbow, is my favorite song in Oz. One thing I did want to jump in about with Cukor's involvement in really bringing Dorothy out and bringing her to the screen is that it's so interesting how it took George Cukor's involvement to basically bring Judy out in the character when Judy was always looked at as Dorothy. They wanted her specifically for the role of Dorothy because she was Dorothy. She encompassed Dorothy. And yet in the Thorpe era, they're unjudifying her, for lack of a better term, and they're completely hiding Judy. Yet this role was for her. So it's always very interesting that it took a whole other director, someone who hadn't been involved in the film prior to this point, to bring the Judy out of Dorothy, or bring the Dorothy out of Judy.
Actually,
it's really like it's like the Star is Born scene ultimately, isn't it? Where she goes into the makeup room. It's spot on.
George Cukor.
Yeah, and actually, interestingly, that movie George is making that comment actually within that film somehow about what he actually did for her just before, with the removal of the blonde wig, and I think there's the plastic on the nose, and obviously all the makeup that goes with that. So yes, he had obviously had such a huge impact on that movie.
The Cukor section of the Wizard of Oz history should be headlined, "Your face is just dandy."
Yeah.
I think just picking up on talking about Jack Haley and if I Only Had a Heart, I hope this is right and it's not something I've read that is completely wrong. That is Snow White that does the little "Wherefore Art Thou, Romeo" in that, isn't it?
Above a voice sings low.
Wherefore art thou, Romeo?
Yes, this was one of the inside jokes in the music department, that Adriana Castellati had been the voice of Disney's Snow White, which had been the huge box office success of late 1937 way through 1938. So when they started pre-recording Oz in that autumn of 38, she came in and I think she was paid $100 to say "Wherefore Art Thou, Romeo?" And that was when Buddy Ebsen was pre-recording the Tin Man's song. So when Jack Haley came in and had to re-record it, they just clipped Adriana Castellotti's line out of the Evson version and dumped it into the
Mhm.
And when we did the 50th anniversary book, the Green Oz book, 102 years ago now, Jack Haley Jr. had become kind of he had become a friend. It was through him that I got permission from MGM to write that book. And that's another whole saga for if ever you want to hear it. But that's why we asked him to then do the introduction to the Green Book. And he's the one who explained that the voice that Jack Haley uses in The Wizard of Oz was Jack Haley's own creation. Because when he came on the set, Victor Fleming said to him, how do you envision, playing the character? And Jack said, well, I think, I'll use the voice I use when I tell my kids bedtime stories, which is this kind of, well, a long time, a fairy tale character kind of voice, but it still was intrinsically the sound of Jack Haley, which is why it worked. Yeah, a million pieces to this mosaic, but they're all fascinating. Cukor, not only Judy, but Ray Bolger's makeup was softened, and Margaret Hamilton's hair, instead of being flipped, if not Leah Michelle, then for those of us in an older generation, it's Marlo Thomas as that girl. All this hair was kind of pulled up, and that better showed off her jawline, and her nose was augmented, and she got the wart on the chin with the hair growing out of it was made more prominent. And that was his doing. Again, I don't know who to credit for the revised Yellow Brick Road, but as I always say, instead of looking like a patio in Pomona, which is what it looked like under Thorpe, the bricks were regular rectangle bricks. The road was curbed. The corn stalks were done in shiny plastic. So it looked like a beautiful fairy tale cornfield, but it still looked like a cornfield, and it still looked like a yellow brick road, not a yellow brick barbecue.
I've actually always wondered that, because you can see the sheen in Munchkin Land off the flowers and the plants, and the same in the cornfield. I always wondered, was that intentional to give it a kind of a shiny, magical feel to it?
Well, I think absolutely. Plus the fact that they weren't going to be able to go out and find flowers that big, so it's like, if we're going to build them, the concept, there was stuff in the publicity about Oz in 1939 where the set designer was saying, we imagined the Munchkin as living, being so tiny that they were almost like little ants. And so their drawings were like their homes were like little ant hills, and the flowers would be, infinitely taller than the ants themselves. So that, again, that was all the creativity that MGM was given freedom to expand upon.
Yeah, I always remember that set, even from a kid, when she walks out into Munchkin Land and seeing just like how blue that water looked and how shiny everything was covered almost in plastic wrap. And I always just remember that set itself really looked surreal, but I guess obviously that's the whole point, isn't it? That's what they're trying to create.
Well, yeah, if you're going to and make the most of the color. I mean, I think that was MGM was very smart too, that in the Oz book, Judy is met when she comes out of the house by the Good Witch of the North and 3 Munchkins. Period. She does all of the set up in the shoes under the house and the Wicked Witch and Go to the Wizard. It's all done with just those 4 extraneous characters. When she walks down the Yellow Brick Road and she's changed into her best dress, the blue and white dress, between her arrival and going down the Yellow Brick Road, she comes to a prosperous Munchkin farmer's home. And there are live 5 little fiddlers, which MGM incorporated into the number too, but playing for the party, and there's food and there's dancing, and all the little Munchkins, maybe they don't say how many, but a couple dozen, are celebrating the death of the Wicked Witch of the East. And the Munchkins, who recognize who Dorothy is by reputation, invite her to come to the party and dine with them and then spend the night. And so MGM coalesced those 2 factors and made all that color of Munchkin Land, not just the set, but the costumes and the diversity of the costumes and every primary and secondary color you can imagine, so that when they got to color, you knew it.
I used to love, well, still do, but I used to love the Munchkin Land sets when I was a kid. Okay, so are you all ready to go onto our scene by scene breakdown? So we'll start with Well, in my mind, it's legendary, the opening title and music. I'm not going to do it because I can't sing or hum in tune, but it's just that those first few notes of music, the lion goes and then the music comes, and then you've got Victor Fleming's The Wizard of Oz. There's in the American Masters biography which you worked on, John, this part always gives me chills when it's discussing young Judy and about, you know, finding a project to make her a star, and it shows a clip of her in Thoroughbreds Don't Cry saying, I'm going to be a great singer, I'm going to be a great actress too.
I'm going to be a great singer. And I'm going to be a great actress too. Are you really? Yes. Oh, yes.
And then it cuts to the opening of The Wizard of Oz. It always gives me chills because the opening of The Wizard of Oz just gives me chills. That's my contribution. So anybody else?
Well, I get that. I echo that as well, because I don't know if any of you, John, I'm sure you have been to the screenings they do now of The Wizard of Oz with the live orchestra accompanying the movie. And I remember the first one of those I went to was maybe about 2007. It was done in Dublin. And the conductor came out on stage, everybody clapped, took a bow, and he went, boom, and we all got some fright because of the sound of that initial start of it.
It's the most iconic opening sequence, I think, in film history. And John, I was actually watching your commentary on The Wizard of Oz to prepare for this, and you mentioned that there were 35 different opening titles that were considered. Is that correct?
Yeah, they again, it was like, how do we present this? There was the idea that they would start with Leo the Lion in black and white, and then the title would be in color. The Wizard of Oz would be in color, and then it would go back to black and white or sepia, have it as you will, and different letterings. There's a famous still of them shooting the opening title to The Wizard of Oz, but it's the lettering, but it's superimposed on the kind of the sculpture of Leo the Lion in the background that's used, I think, at the beginning of Babes in Arms and, you know, several other major movies, you know, that MGM, that kind of lion in profile sitting down or lying down. Yeah. So I think they tried all kinds of stuff. There was a very elaborate one where a big glass bowl of black liquid with the words The Wizard of Oz on it in paint or in letters would be held up to the camera, the way you see them do the reverse shot of the house falling out of the sky. You know, they held the house up to the camera in the roof and then dropped it into the cloudy floor hundreds of feet below, or 20, 40 feet below. And you saw this house falling from a close-up down and crashing amidst all these clouds. Well, they ran that backwards. So you saw the house in the clouds and then coming up to the camera as if to indicate that the house is falling out of the sky and it's going to land in Munchkin land. Well, they tried that with this lettering stuff too, where this ball would be Wizard of Oz in white on black lettering, and it would be in a close-up like that with the letters big, and the ball would drop and smash all over the soundstage. And they would then rerun the film, and what you would see would be all these fragments coming together, and then the ball coming up and coming up and coming up to a close-up of the titles to make it dramatic. Well, none of that was used. Instead, I always say the only exterior footage in the Wizard of Oz movie is under the opening and closing credits, the sky, clouds in the sky. Everything else was done inside on sound stages. But the music is so evocative. I'm glad you guys react, because that bum 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 bum, which is Glinda's theme. That's a da 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 da, and then which Steven Spielberg adapts very cautiously as the tones that are played to the spaceship at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Time. It's there are only 5 notes instead of 6, but the intervals and the feeling is very much the same. And Spielberg, being a patent Wizard of Oz fan, you just get the sense that there's a little bit of homage going on there. The other thing, and Carly, you can take this out because I don't know how personal any of you get, but I have to say that one of my favorite, James's affinity for Judy Garland has always, I loved from, your pregnancy days. But when you showed that video clip of him, I guess maybe in the kitchen, and he's in profile and he's coloring or playing with something on the table, and in the background the Wizard of Oz video is starting, and you can hear the overture playing, the credits are rolling, and James is just coloring away and drawing away, and the overture comes to an end, da 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 da, bum bum, and the Mendelssohn starts, da 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 da, and James just looks up and says, "Here she comes," and it's like you look at the screen and he knows what's happening. But that is what it was like for all of us with that film. And again, I didn't see The Wizard of Oz in color until I was 19 years old, when I went away to college, where there was a color set in our dorm. And I only saw it once a year from 1956, then to 59, and on through the 60s. And the emotion attendant to waiting for it, and to waiting for it to start, and hearing that music, it meant just as much in black and white. It meant just as much coming out of a little tiny TV speaker. If you love it and you know what it foretells in terms of this is what's coming, nothing like it. And Oz's overture does that as well as anything ever did.
One of the things that you mentioned actually earlier, I think it was Carly, is actually that, people in 1939, they went to look at the film to be a Technicolor film. And I always think, when they first saw those credits that showed up in black and white or sepia at the time, they must have thought, "Oh, hang on a second, what's going on here?" So it's just such an interesting choice to film the Kansas scenes or the opening scene in black and white, and then Oz obviously later on in color. I just think that's such a genius idea when you think about where technology was at that time, and that use of Technicolor, and kind of how new film was. I mean, sound had only been around for 10 years at that time, maybe a little bit longer. So yeah, I just think that's such a genius. And I'm not sure who was actually behind that decision. I don't know if any of you guys know whose decision that ultimately was to shoot in black and white first.
I think some of it came out of the Baum book, actually, because even though there are no farmhands, there's no Miss Gulch and no Professor Marvel in the Baum book, he uses the word gray 9 times in the first chapter to describe the Kansas prairie in drought, Aunt Em and Uncle Henry being old and gray, the boards of the fence in the barn and the house being weathered and gray, and the only thing that wasn't gray was Dorothy's dog. And he's the one who kept her laughing and happy and playing. So I think some of it came out of that. I think some of it was just good showmanship, again, which ran and galloped massively at MGM in those years. I've heard many stories, well, not many, because very few people are around who saw the movie first run. But when we were one of you held up an Oz book? Sarah, you held up the horizontal Oz book, yes? That John Shershikin and I did together, 2009, I think it was. And we went to his hometown in Missouri. It was one of the places we did a book signing, and friends and relatives and all of his people were there, and the line just went. And toward the end of the line, there was this little 80-something-year-old woman who had been standing with her book waiting to have it signed. And she was so tiny, if I'd seen her, I would have said, bring her up or give her a chair or something. But she said, I had to talk to you. She said, because this movie has always been so important to me. And it came to our little town here in Missouri. She said it had played everywhere else before it got to all the, the small towns, the neighborhood houses where it played like 3 days. But she said Wizard of Oz played the weekend. Those were the important 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And she said the theater was jammed and we all couldn't wait. And she said we knew it was in color, and I think somehow we knew that it didn't start in color. But when we saw color by Technicolor on the screen, we knew, we were just into the music and we were going to see this famous movie that had already been playing and that so many people had talked about. And she said, but after 16, 15, 18 minutes in brown and white, as it were, she said, we were so caught up in the story that I don't think anybody in the theater was even thinking about color. She said, and then Dorothy, Bobby Cochet at that moment, runs into the frame, opens the door, backs out of the frame, and Technicolor Judy walks forward from the back, but you can see Munchkin land in color through the door. She said the whole theater gasped, and they stood up and applauded. They were that moved by the power of Technicolor and the contrast. So again, whosever idea it was, whether it stemmed from Baum or somebody else, Arthur, who knows? There's no way of knowing, but it works.
You know, I'm so glad that they went with the opening titles the way they did. They kept it sepia. Had they done one of their ideas where they switched the title card to color, I think even that little planted seed of color would have really taken away from the magic later on when she goes to Kansas. Oh boy, goes to Oz.
Following the title scene and music, the first scene, you hear the little, as John said, the Mendelssohn. Again, I won't hum it. See Judy and Toto running away from the camera, away from Miss Gulch, because obviously Miss Gulch has threatened to take Toto away or her to go. And then this follows through with scenes where she's bothering Auntie Em and Uncle Henry, who are trying to help the chicks because something's happened with the incubator. Those poor little chicks. As a Connor, that poor bird.
I still laugh over that.
Sorry, private joke. And then we are introduced to the three farm hands. We have Zeke.
Have a little courage, that's all.
Hunk.
Well, your head ain't made of straw, you know.
And Hickory.
Someday they're going to erect a statue to me in this town.
Well, don't start posing for it now.
They were added into the movie as like a precursor to how they would be in Oz. They were introduced to foreshadow them because, again, 1938-39, America, they were a bit worried about a fantasy film, so they wanted to sort of like have a little bit of a root in reality, and they did the same with Miss Gulch as well. So these were like shown as alter egos in Kansas to their Oz counterpart. So that whole scene anyway where she's bothering them all and, you know, trying to get them to listen to her, then we have the scene where she falls into the pigsty. Go ahead, discuss.
I think first of all, my biggest comment would be, and this is kind of the whole opening really, you know, that set is really, bearing in mind that all of that was shot indoors, I think that's a real testament to actually the creative people behind that. I have watched this film obviously many times, and I've watched this film with people who may not have seen the film very often, and people have said to me, you know, was this filmed inside? Like, it really does look like it is on a Kansas farm, or they've created that so amazingly, and that's really my initial observation. Bearing in mind the matte paintings that were used and obviously the detail that went into the set, I just think it's amazing.
It's a huge testament to the set designers and the special effects as well, because even now, I mean, now we see the film in 4K, you know, and I don't think anybody back then was ever even dreaming that it would be viewed that way in such great detail. And it still looks incredible. It still looks amazing. I think the only time that you really kind of see that it is definitely a set is in Munchkin Land in the 4K. You kind of see, you know, you can really see where the wall and the floor meet each other and where the backdrop is in the 4K. That's what I noticed right away. But anyway, it's just amazing that a film, you know, that was made in 1939, viewed in 4K, still looks authentic.
I've had the opportunity of watching it twice with two adults who are, like, as in nearly in their 30s, who have never seen The Wizard of Oz before in their lives. And the first person I showed it to, and I was telling him, I said, right, you know, this is this. And he goes, what year was this again? I said, 1939. And he's like, 1939? I don't think he knew what to expect. But after it, he said, 1939? I said, yeah. He said, it's more like an 80s film. It doesn't look like it's from 1939. I was like, see?
Yeah, I saw this film at the IMAX back in 2013, and I was actually really blown away just by how much detail was in it, and it just looked amazing. So yeah, it really does hold up, especially in these, like I say, all across the board really. And we can kind of, allow Munchkin Land to look a little bit like a set, because I think that's kind of the whole pantomime of it. But the Kansas scenes, especially, they do look really authentic.
I just a couple of points. When I talk about Wizard of Oz, one of the points I make is that there was no such thing as CGI in 1938-39. That everything that they're about to see, you know, if I'm introducing a screening, they had to make. It had to be made literally out of whole cloth, as the saying goes in the case of the tornado. And, you know, it's all drawings and paintings and artifice. And it was all done by hand, not on a computer, but with wood and paint and paper and cloth and all the rest of it, chicken wire, which is always, again, astounding to people who are watching it, because they think, well, yeah, you can do this. But even CGI would be hard pressed to make Oz look as good. You know, there was a lot of CGI, of course, in Oz the Great and Powerful, and a film that I enjoyed, but it looked more like a pastel version of Peter Jackson's New Zealand than it looked to me like what Oz is supposed to look like. We know what Oz is supposed to look like. We're Ozians. But anyway, the other point I wanted to make too is that one of the most affecting things about the Oz book and the Oz movie is that, again, in the Oz book, Dorothy, Toto, Aunt Em, Uncle Henry, and the Prairie are introduced in like a page and a half of text, and then the tornado comes. So children are immediately riveted by that story. They get the basics, and then the action starts. MGM it's the same way. You go into the book, and you're immediately going on the journey with this kid. The moment Judy Garland comes on, the moment that James introduces Judy Garland on screen, here she is, out she comes, and she is problematic. She is really concerned about something. And this was late scripting. The early scripts, Dorothy was going to ride home from school carefree and singing on a pony. You know, and that, or there were going to be these, you're going to see a book and Judy Garland as Dorothy, and you turn the page. There are all these crazy ideas. But no, John Lee Mahan, who was Victor Fleming's right-hand man on set in terms of scripting and ad-libbing and that kind of stuff, John Lee, I believe, oversaw all of this Kansas rewriting to make it urgent, to make Dorothy have something that was going to concern everybody who was watching, and especially concern kids, because there wasn't a child in the audience who couldn't relate to the idea of being in trouble with a teacher, having trouble waiting at home, worrying about a pet. I mean, boom, boom, boom. You were all wrapped up heart and soul by the time Judy got to Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, who didn't have time for her. Something, again, kids could relate to that. The farmhands who are extolling, do this, do that, and then going about their business. By the time Miss Gulch came on, you know, and everybody had talked about her, and she was set up in everybody's mind. And then Judy sings the killer ballad of all time as only she can. And then and it's like, no, it's not a stage wait. It's Judy Garland singing what is a Judy Garland song for all time. But then, boom, as soon as it's over, there's Miss Gulch. When they showed the film for the 50th anniversary one night at the Museum of Modern Art, it launched the 50th anniversary VHS tape and the Green Book. It was a big, big event. And it was invitation only, and it was a lot of New York movers and shakers and young executives, corporate men and corporate women in their, you know, late 20s, 30s, 40s. And on the escalator down to the theater, the head of MGM who was there said, "John, will you introduce the screening tonight?" And it was like, right now, you know, you couldn't have thought to ask me this an hour ago or a day ago or a week ago. So I got up and did it, and it was lovely because we had two of them. Meinhardt Robbie, the coroner, was there, and Mickey Carroll, one of the fiddlers, was there. And they took a bow, and the whole audience, you know, all these sophisticated executive New York types were totally enraptured by this and thrilled to be there. And I went and sat down, and the movie started, and everybody's reacting, and everybody is kind of chuckling at, oh, there are the farmhands, and there's Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, and there's the dog, and now she's going to sing about the rainbow. Oh, nice, oh, nice, oh, nice. Why then, oh, why can't I? Da-da-da-da-da-da. And all of a sudden, the whole audience was electrified, and they were all 5 years old again. It was like, ah! They all audibly reacted to the appearance of Margaret Hamilton. Again, power of movie, power of a movie, the power of the movie.
I love that, like, Miss Gulch Misculch's theme music and the Wicked Witches. Like, it's so sinister and foreboding. It's genius. It's, oh, I love it.
And somebody told me that they got that by distorting, when we did the 2 CD Rhino soundtrack set in 1995, 96, whenever that was, and we had access to all underscoring recordings. One of the guys, who either we found the archival interview or he came and talked to us, he said they got da-da-da-da-da-da by warping. We're off to see the wizard. So da-da-da-da-da-da became da-da-da-da-da-da. That is.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah, mind blown.
Has anybody got anything else to add about the first few scenes before we move on to Over the Rainbow?
There's that Jack Haley scene that was cut after Ray Bolger said, hits his finger and Judy walks off. The next thing you see is Bert Lahr putting the pigs into the pen. But there was a scene with Judy and Jack Haley in between that where he shows her this mechanical invention he's made to ward off storms. And it squirts oil in his eye, number one. He says, you got to remember, Dorothy, Miss Gulch doesn't have a heart. Here's something that really has a heart. My machine. Let me show you how it works. I mean, so there was even more of that. Luckily, the statue to me was enough so that, because then again, it came back to, when the tornado is coming and Uncle Henry is saying,
Hey, Hickory!
and there was a cutaway to a scene of Jack Haley trying to rev up his machine to ward off the tornado. You didn't need any of that stuff, but it was there.
So the next scene after that is, it's not really very important. It's a very, very unknown song, sung very poorly by a very unknown singer. It's a little song called Over the Rainbow.
Not Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
Yeah, it's called Over the Rainbow.
I get yelled at by some fans who say, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a hell of a lot of difference at the Copyright Office because the name of the song is Over the Rainbow. This is published as Over the Rainbow. It won the Academy Award as Over the Rainbow.
Go on, does anyone have any opinions of this legendary performance before we go through all its accolades?
Oh, none whatsoever.
My main thing about Judy's version of Over the Rainbow, which is the ultimate version, is it's simple. So many singers since have taken it and they've messed with the arrangements, tried to make the range larger, but as the Phil, his name is, isn't it, in Wings of Pegasus points out, you don't get any extra points for singing higher if it's not necessary. Sing within your range. And what Judy does with that song in her comfortable range is just magical.
Yeah, and it's pitch perfect the whole way, really flawless, I think. I did watch the film with somebody who actually is a singer, who again wasn't as familiar with the film, but listened to that song, and the comment I remember exactly was, wow, there was not one off note in that whole song at all. It was really, really smooth. And I think the video that you're referring to, Sarah, is actually when they analysed that and removed the soundtrack, you can hear that more than ever, really, can't you? And there's no auto-tune. There might be no CGI, but there's definitely no auto-tune back then either. So what you see is what you get.
I want to discuss the filming of Over the Rainbow. Because again, it's King V's already mentions how he shot it and continuously had him moving instead of, which often happens in musicals, you add your star who just sing, in front of the camera or on a stage, but he kept it, moving and flowing, quite seamless. Does anyone want to discuss that?
It's just a testament, isn't it, to the creative people behind it. Again, thinking about the time when it was actually filmed. I think it was even again like 8 years before when they would have had, I don't know, like a Broadway melody or 1929 or whatever, they would have just had it as a vaudeville act and somebody standing in a bar and singing a song. But again, I think like you were saying, Sarah, the fact that it is very fluid, kind kind of reminds me of something similar to The Man That Got Away, in the sense of that long take, because obviously Judy was really well known for being able to sustain long takes like that. So I guess I don't know whether that was the thought process behind it.
I was just going to say, Paul, that I think you can spot in the film it's two takes put together, because her hair changes. You can spot where the hairstyle changes, so it's two put together. And I also love, I just love watching Toto as well. I think he's just so, well, she is adorable in it, and the paw and everything. And I was watching it at Christmas with my mum's new dog, who was only 6 months old at the time, and here he was watching Toto like that.
Carly, I can add, but I don't want to cut you off.
Well, I do have one little story to share with regards to Over the Rainbow. And I blame this for James's, vast affinity for Judy Garland. When I was pregnant with James, and I've told this story many times before, but I'll tell it again. One of the things that, when you're pregnant with a baby, they can hear outside. They can hear it. So what I used to do is I used to put a speaker up to my belly, and I would always play Over the Rainbow. And when later on, obviously, when he was born, one of the only songs that I could play that would help calm him down when he was crying was Over the Rainbow. So Judy Garland's voice was one of the first that James had ever heard. And ever since then, he's been enamored with her.
If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh, why can't
Points to make about Rainbow, because they tie in with you guys said, the movement, as Sarah said. King Vidor takes credit for that. Of course, he was the last of the directors to come in, and he did all the Kansas stuff and a few, I think, retakes in color. But he said it was his idea to give movement. He said because the fluidity was important. He said you used to just have the camera focus. It was because the camera was difficult to move, and it was a ballad, and what are you going to do with a ballad? And so you just show the close-up of the singer, you show the close-up of the median shot. But he said no, we had the farm machinery, we set it up so that there was some movement to it. And again, the point about the two takes is interesting too, because when she's resting against the bale of hay, or the hay stack, when she moves away from it, there's a little bit of hair, a little bit of hay sticking to the back of her hair. And when they do the cutaway to Toto, and she gets to the farm machine, she's holding on it, the little bit of hay is gone, a little bit of straw isn't there anymore. So, and then a point about Toto. We talked about the heat of the lights holding up filming, and Judy's schooling holding up filming. And Jack Haley gave an interview in 1939. He was in New York playing Lowe's State when Judy and Mickey came in to do the Capitol with Wizard of Oz. And he was at the luncheon the day before the Capitol at the Waldorf with the two kids. And he gave an interview about Oz at the time that Lowe's State MGM had set up. And he said that it was, the dog took up so much time, because again, you had to wait to get the take where the dog was doing what the dog was supposed to do. The dog was brilliant, but you just had to get the best take of the dog responding, or the dog reacting, or the dog lifting up its paw, or whatever. So that just again adds to the 6-month shooting schedule it took them to finish Wizard of Oz. That's related, but we might as well talk about it now while we're on the subject.
Anyone want to add anything about Judy's relationship with Toto, who was called Terry at the time, who was actually female? Did change the name to Toto after the Wizard of Oz. She wanted to adopt her, didn't she?
Yeah, but I think wasn't it their owner who realised actually what a little cash cow they might have had in their pet, who ultimately didn't, because I believe that Terry or Toto went on to have quite the screen career for a very short life of a dog. And I believe is there a memorial in Hollywood too, because the the actual dog wasn't buried there, but I believe there's a statue to Toto in Hollywood. I'm definitely going to check that out when I go next year. I'll add that to my long list of things to do over there. But yeah, that's interesting. They probably realized how much of a moneymaker the dog could have been.
I think he was, or she was, buried on the owner's ranch, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a freeway or a highway being built ultimately over that much later, and unfortunately Toto Terry's resting place is under all that, so they put the memorial in instead.
The nice thing, Paul, for your trip or for anybody's trip is that the Toto Memorial is at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, where Judy has been relocated now. So
yeah.
Anything else about Over the Rainbow?
Oh, you could talk for the next 17 hours about Judy and Over the Rainbow.
Yeah, what about the fact it was again, this is another thing that's been exaggerated to the hilt, but it was almost cut.
Well, it was, people felt it was going to slow the picture down, which I dare I say, I kind of understand. I think had it been any other singer except Judy, it had the potential to do that, given it was so early on and it's a slow song, and people want to come for the Technicolor aspect. But whoever it was that made the decision not to cut it, I'm pretty glad that choice was there. I think they made the right choice. Let's just say
it's credited to Arthur Freed, isn't it, that it stayed in the movie? So. Yeah,
I think he threatened to walk off.
Yeah.
Well, that is basically the story as it has been come across. I think Mervyn LeRoy fought for it too. But the great thing about Over the Rainbow and Arthur Freed is that by July 1939, when the decisions were made as to the final edit of The Wizard of Oz, after 3 or 4 sneak previews, Arthur wasn't Arthur anymore. Arthur was the associate producer of Wizard of Oz, which was testing very well. And Arthur was in the midst of shooting Babes in Arms, which looked like a powerhouse even then. And when the arguments came up about Wizard of Oz, the song publishers not being crazy about Over the Rainbow, the kids aren't going to like it, the teen all-important, or the becoming more important teen audience. But Arthur, and Mayer he was letting all the arguments flow. And Arthur went to Louis B. Mayer, and this comes from several people, give him credit, Harburg and Arlen say this, but Arthur just went to Louis B. Mayer and said, look, the song stays or I go. And Mayer was very savvy. I think he knew, all of a sudden he was starting to realize that he might have in Arthur Freed what he wanted from Mervyn LeRoy, that this was his new Thalberg, that he had his finger on the pulse of what musicals should be and a direction MGM should go. And so Arthur, I think, Mervyn would have backed him. But again, by July 1939, Mervyn's first movies, the ones that he'd been working on, Dramatic School and I think Stand Up and Fight or something like that, and the Marx Brothers at the Circus, which was in production, Dramatic School had tanked and gotten terrible reviews. Mervyn LeRoy's first produced picture at MGM. Stand Up and Fight, I think, made a little bit of money, but it certainly wasn't the kind of thing that that The Good Earth had been, or that Romeo and Juliet had been, or that San Francisco and The Great Ziegfeld had been. All, Dinner at 8, Grand Hotel, all things that Thalberg had his finger in, or his thumb in, whatever. So, and I think, Paul, you're absolutely right about the fact that, because it was Judy Garland, and it was Judy Garland singing a song that people fell in love with instantly. And it was a very basic, there was no verse to get in the way. It went right to the basic melody. What they call the AABA form of songwriting, the A melody for 8 bars, then the A melody with different words for 8 bars, then the bridge, the B section with a new melody and new words, and then back to the A section with the added tag. And so, so it was accessible to an audience, a listening audience. Judy Garland sang it. They loved Judy Garland's voice. A lot of people, she'd had her first hit records and on the radio and the earlier movies. And it was a movie with Judy Garland top billed, so they knew she was going to be singing. This wasn't terribly long. It fit the mood, it fit the picture. It was a character song. It was telling you about Dorothy. And so all of that was very important. One thing that has only recently started to be brought out about the editing of The Wizard of Oz is that the jitterbug was already gone after the first preview for whatever multiple reasons. It was out. When they started talking about taking out Over the Rainbow, it was like, wait a minute. You take out Over the Rainbow, and the only thing Judy Garland sings in this movie is 2 lines of Munchkin Land. The house began to pitch. One line, If I Only Had a Heart, and group singing, and 1 line in the Merry Land of Oz, and group singing in Off to See the Wizard. That was it. And you can't do that. You got to give her a song, a song, any song. Throw them a bone. Well, they didn't throw a bone. They threw a prime rib, and she got to sing the Rainbow. But again, it was common sense. And so many of the legends about Wizard of Oz have been inflated from a lack of common sense thinking or a lack of common sense reporting, or again, somebody trying to make something out of nothing. And the stories get exaggerated and exaggerated beyond wherever they were before in the last dozen years.
So after the Over the Rainbow, she mentions we have Miss Gulch's, we hear Miss Gulch's leitmotif come in, and we're introduced to Miss Gulch, who is coming to take Toto away. And then we have the scene in the house where she actually takes him away. We're going to do Myth Bust 2. Well, we probably busted more than 2 myths by now, but this is Myth Bust 2 on my script. Margaret Hamilton was Judy's only friend on set. Nobody else liked her. They were jealous of her. Vice versa, they were mean to her.
I remember the first time that I remember hearing about this was in, I believe it was Anne Edwards' book, which is actually the first book that I ever read on Judy. Yeah, it was the first book I ever read. I was very, very young. But yeah, I read that, and I think that she made a big point about that, and that was, I don't know if that's where it originated from, but I don't know whether people latch onto that because it's such a contrast from obviously the Dorothy and Wicked Witch of the West scenario, and people love a contrast, and then they make it seem like Judy and her were friends. But then it also links into that whole perception that she was either, for lack of a better word, depressed, having a horrendous time. She needed that confidant. I'm sure they probably did like each other, but guess what? A lot of other people liked her as well. And it wasn't an unusual thing for that to happen. So I don't really know where that has quite originated from.
Anne Edwards is also responsible for the coffee and cigarettes story as well. That first appears in there, but it's after The Wizard of Oz. She writes it. It's more around like the 1940, around like Strike the Band, Little Nelly Kelly time. But yeah, they were friends apparently. But
there was actually a really cute story in the Frank biography where Judy was visiting Margaret Hamilton in her dressing room and was all excited because she was about to graduate high school and she was showing off her dress and all excited. And Margaret Hamilton was just like kind of watching her in awe because here's this girl who's destined for stardom and she's so excited over graduating high school.
I was just going to say, and obviously, you jump ahead 30 years, you've got them reunited when I believe Judy hosted the Merv Griffith show, which unfortunately we don't have the footage for. We've got the audio, but again, I think it's quite a nice reunion as such, especially, because unfortunately we didn't get to see Judy, in the 70s when many of the cast members were having interviews and having a lot of reunions. Unfortunately, she wasn't involved in that. So I think it's quite nice that we've got the two of them, albeit in audio quality. Audio only, sorry, of them actually having, which makes her do the Wicked Witch laugh. I thought it was quite cute.
Have they got your broom? No, I don't. We're going to use a New York broom called the bus. Oh, darling. Well, I missed you. Well, you're my favorite witch. I better be. Well, I think you're everybody's favorite lady. Laugh, just do that wicked me laugh.
Oh, that. But I mean, we have Judy and Ray Bulger on her television show in the 60s on their Tea for Two with just the most gorgeous little chat amongst them, showing the photos and talking about it. I mean, all you have to do is look at that and it's clear. I mean, I know we don't have any evidence of Jack Haley and Bert Lahr with her, you know, in an interview situation, but all you have to do is look at the Ray Bulger show and know, well, at least she was friendly with one of them. And again, if you do any more digging, she cancelled one of the concerts the night after Bert Lahr died, and then the next night dedicated Over the Rainbow to him for her lovely Cowardly Lion. I mean, come on.
Well, and on top of all that, you know, there's a picture of her hugging Jack Haley in a nightclub in the 1950s. There's the great story about Bert Lahr being at the opening night of the Palace in 1967 and leading her out on the dance floor at the El Morocco at the opening night party. And when the other dancers realized which two people were dancing together, everybody else backed off the dance floor, and it was just Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion all by themselves out there. And Judy herself saying, you know, they kidded the life out of me, but you know, very friendly. As far as Margaret Hamilton is concerned, you have to realize that Margaret Hamilton wasn't on the set that much. So, you know, if they were going to bond, they bonded at what moments they had. And Judy's scenes were predominantly with, you know, were one-on-one with Margaret Hamilton, one-on-two with Margaret Hamilton. Billie Burke wasn't ungracious, but she wasn't going to be, you know, just kibitzing and talking, and you know, Margaret Hamilton would have affinity for this 16-year-old girl, Margaret Hamilton having been a teacher and all the rest of it, and seeing Judy go off to class and then come back and work and go off to class and come back and work. One of the things I want to mention just about the scene though, when Miss Gulch comes in, the scene in the parlor between Miss Gulch, Judy, Aunt Em, and Uncle Henry is again all one take. From the beginning it starts until Uncle Henry laughs and shrugs. There's a cutaway to Judy's close-up getting emotional about Toto being taken away, but the rest of it is all one fluid take. And again, it's so good for establishing the emotion and the, you know, keeping you involved in the story. You're not distracted. You are looking at those people and hearing what they're saying. It's very smart movie making.
For 23 years, I've been dying to tell you what I thought of you. And now, well, being a Christian woman, I can't say it.
Can I just say Aunt Em's greatest line in the whole movie takes place there. I still laugh at this every time I see it.
So does an audience, which is wonderful if you see it with a group of people.
It says nothing but means everything.
Oh, yeah. It's like Aunt Em was throwing some shades, like, you know.
What I like about the scene too, it happens twice in Oz. What I love is Dorothy may be a Kansas farm girl of roughly 12 years in the script, but she's an enormously sophisticated Kansas farm girl, because anybody exclaims, Toto darling, or Lion darling. I mean, it's kind of like training in a way. And it's wonderful because it gives her that wonderful sense of being a teenager on the brink of young womanhood, playing somebody younger than she is, but then again, involving the emotions of all the audience. That's one of the greatest points that Christopher Finch makes in the Rainbow text in his book, that she is 16 playing younger, but able to sing like an adult and display emotions like an adult, thus bringing in any age that sees that performance.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's another point about Over the Rainbow, and I know you've mentioned this, Connor, when you were in camp, but
yeah, so
many people say to me, I mean, some of them can be a bit dismissive, but a few of them are quite in awe, but like, oh, her voice is too old for her, or, you know, her voice is a lot older than her face.
Yeah, well, somebody literally said to me, that can't be her singing that. It's like, it is.
Yeah, so Miss Gulch takes Toto and he escapes out the basket, and he comes back and Dorothy says we've got to run away, and this is where they come upon Professor Marvel. I actually didn't have this in the script, but I'm going to throw in another myth bust here. We won't go off track too much. This was new to me. I only came upon it a few weeks back. That apparently, if you're ready for this one, Frank Morgan had a whole bar of alcohol in his briefcase on set.
I've never heard that one.
I didn't heard that.
Oh no, he had a little carrying case with his alcohol in it.
He really did?
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Actors who was allowed to tipple, as I said, on the set. And Judy, there's a quote, it's in the Portrait and Art and Anecdote book where she says, you couldn't believe he knew what he was doing, and he did it so well. And that's the absolute truth. I'm not
that one was true.
I'm stumbling drunk, but he did enjoy his
a tipple.
His alcohol. Yes, indeed.
I'm not sure was the it's an interesting one with that whole kind of piece with them in the I was going to call it a caravan, but it's definitely not. What is it? It's like the this little traveling. Yeah, I think that whole piece in there. Again, getting back to your point originally, John, about the whole book, where when you go there, it's really only a page and a half. So it's interesting that they added all this subplot back in before she even arrives in Oz. I think it gives the character a little bit more depth, really, and a bit more context to why she wants to get home, because it's such a contradiction to what she wants to do in the first part of the movie.
She wants to go where she's loved, and she finds out that she was loved at home all the time. And the people she's with in Oz, the good ones remind her how much she was loved. I think the Professor Marvel stuff was added by, I'd have to go back and read what I wrote, but I think it was added by Ryerson and Wolfe, because again, Ed Wynn was wanted for the part of the wizard, and he turned it down because the early scripts he saw by Noel Langley, the wizard was the only role he'd have. It was Ryerson and Wolfe's idea to add, have him be the guardian of the gate, the cabbie, the soldier, all of that kind of stuff. So, but by then they had moved on from Ed Wynn, and then again, Ed Wynn was going to, or Professor Marvel was going to have a midget assistant. Then he was going to have a lion in a cage. Then he was going to have a doofus assistant played by Burt Lahr. There were all of these conceptions it took them from January of 38 till October of 38 to start shooting this film. When originally in January, they thought, well, we'll be shooting by April. We can have the movie in theaters by Christmas, not by a long shot, the fact that, the lion earlier, we didn't mention this in casting, but the lion was going to be tenor Kenny Baker, because he was going to be a Prince of Oz who was in love with the Princess of Oz who sang opera. So Betty James and Judy could sing opera versus jazz kind of stuff in the Emerald City. Gratefully, that plot went, but we got opera versus jazz and Babes in Arms with Judy and Betty James. Kenny Baker as the prince was going to sing love duets with Princess Betty James, and then be transformed into a cowardly lion by the Wicked Witch of the West at some point. And then he was out, and they were going to we'll use the real MGM lion and dub in a voice. Like, that wouldn't take extra months to do. And then by that point, Yip and Harold were there, and it was there, they plugged Burt Lahr. But that went from January to May by the time, or June even, before Burt Lahr was considered. And in between, we had Leo the Lion and Kenny Baker and Betty James. And Betty James and the Prince, Kenny Baker, were part of all the Noel Langley scripts. And Miss Gulch was in Kansas, was going to be Mrs. Gulch and have a son, so that the Wicked Witch of the West could have a dim-witted son she wants to put on the throne of the Emerald City. And Arlen and Harburg would write a song called Death to the Wizard of Oz, where the Winkies march on the Capitol. I mean, all of this was in those early scripts, and much, 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 much more. Dorothy and the Wizard going up in the witch's balloon, and the balloon being destroyed by a woodpecker, and Galinda having to summon the Munchkin Fire Department to be underneath them to catch them when they fell to the ground. These are all scripted scenes. Speaking of the Professor Marvel scene, it's one of the great acted scenes between the two of them, because it's a two-person scene, and they are really relating to each other. I would have loved to have seen a long shot of the two of them, one whole take, in the professor's wagon, because I'm sure it was brilliantly acted. We get the great close-ups of Judy instead, and insert close-ups of Morgan, and it plays beautifully. But the acting all the way, I think one of the times Judy first went to my heart as a young adult was when I saw Wizard of Oz on screen when I was in college, and she's talking to Professor Marvel, and he says,
"Why, she's crying. Someone has hurt her. Someone has just about broken her heart."
Me?
Well, it's someone
like
she loves.
between her eyes and her voice, I knew I would cry at one point during the session today. And but I mean, again, it just resonates so strongly. Why people fell in love with her and why people fell in love with Dorothy, and why she could never escape Dorothy, because Dorothy was the quintessential kid, and the quintessential, not only the quintessential kid, but the quintessential kid who could put forward adult emotions with no restraint behind them. Every restraint. She was not hysteric. She was not, it was not a, she was not acting. And that was the difference. And the keynote of Judy Garland's performance in this picture and in everything she did. And again, but you look at Professor Marvel, I mean, Frank Morgan is doing all of his Frank Morgan bits, but they are totally real and believable as Professor Marvel. And Judy is playing as Dorothy, who is getting this sudden, I mean, 1,000 frames of film earlier, she was saying, "Can we go along with you?" And within 2 minutes more of film, she's saying, "I've got to go home right now."
Yeah.
What means it to her? And then of course she gets sidetracked, and of course her delirium is about her friends on the farm, where her real love is, how much she cares about Aunt Em, Miss Gulch being the constant threat still. MGM was very clever. I mean, I don't know if they were correct in their estimation that an adult audience of 1939 wouldn't buy into fantasy. To a certain extent they were, because when Wizard of Oz did play small towns, there would be reports from the theater owners saying this is a great movie, but we couldn't get in many people because adults, didn't want to see a fairy tale. Snow White was different. Snow White was a novel, and it was cartoons, but it was costumes and all that kind of lions and midgets, and that was not as attractive to adults as it could be. I think the reason it played as well as it did and was one of the 10 best films and one of the top box office films of 39, even without breaking even, is that people did go to see it and did go to see it multiple times and did buy into it immediately, because you had that 15 minutes up front where you got to know the characters even before they became the characters. It's just great movie making, great scripting, and not by anything but accident, by script draft after script draft, 15 writers, 4 directors before they really got started. Comments, please.
I mean, I just agree with everything you said. I think it's, just going back to the plot, I think, it's great acting, but then it also leads us, obviously, as I'm sure we're going to move to in a second, to the famous kind of cyclone theme, which I still think, I might be jumping the gun here, really holds up. Every time I watch that cyclone, it looks real. Probably better than anything they would create now, which would be, I imagine, massively CGI or completely CGI. It really, really does hold up. And even just that whole sequence, I remember the shot of when it's something that's quite commonly, it's like a GIF now, isn't it? Where she's going back to the farmhouse and the wind machine's blowing on her. And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, that wind machine it looks quite, that set looks quite intense. I mean, there's debris blowing around and everything. So it does hold up really, really well.
One thing that always got me is when the wind is blowing and everything's going crazy, the flower pot that's hanging on her porch doesn't move. You would think it would be going off.
But the door blows off.
Which I love.
The door blows off, yeah. But this little flower pot on a string is like.
About tornadoes. I fell in love with meteorology when I fell in love with The Wizard of Oz. And so I have lots of books I got here as a preteen about tornadoes. There weren't many of them, but if they had them, I got them. And you hear stories about, a house being lifted up and there was a candle lit on the kitchen table and the house gets chunked down and the windows are blown out and there's been wind whistling through the house and the house has been not miles in the air, but feet off the ground. And when the house gets deposited, the damn candle is still lit. there was, different eddies of wind and, all the concurrent turmoil of a tornado could have those crazy effects. Of course, also at MGM, they didn't think we would be looking at this movie 80 some years later, frame by frame, and trying to pick out the flower. Exactly. That's what makes it fun. But I know the scene where, Judy gets through the house and then she comes, and again, it's like you don't get to see her legs much in The Wizard of Oz, but she makes the most of it when she's climbing over the fence after the scarecrow when he has fallen down. She gets that skirt up there when she's picking up her skirt to go after the Tin Man and, or after the apples and meets the Tin Man. And when she is, pounding on the cellar door with her foot, which is so dramatic because there's the tornado, the wind is blowing, she's screaming and they can't hear her. And again, the Weather Channel, which we have here in the United States, I don't know that if there's an equivalent in the UK, but it's all weather all day with specials and reports and the regular forecast and what's going on and what to expect. But they've done specials, and they did one called The 100 Greatest Moments in Weather History about 10 years ago. And coming in at like number 53 was the tornado in The Wizard of Oz, because they said it was so well done. I mean, even in the movie Twister, you don't get the same sense of drama from the tornado in The Wizard of Oz. So many of the meteorologists, because like they interviewed 4 or 5 of them, went into meteorology because of that scene in The Wizard of Oz. That is what spurred them on to become storm chasers and weathermen and experts. Again, I don't think MGM did not let down for 1 second in putting The Wizard of Oz together, which is why you can watch it over and over and over, because you always see something new. You always marvel at something in a new way. Now that it's 4K and all the rest of it, now I can pick out the Munchkins in the crowd that I know, or some that I didn't know, but are apparent to me now. Some of the little Munch kids, as they're called, some of the ones who are still alive. Betty Ann Bruno and Priscilla Montgomery, and it's wonderful. It just never stops delighting you.
Don't some meteorologists still say that the cyclone in The Wizard of Oz is the most realistic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a scene, I believe it was actually cut because it was deemed a little bit too frightening, where you can see the tornado approaching the house, and it just engulfs the house. And I think that one little scene is more terrifying than anything else in the film, including the witch. It's haunting.
That scene was never supposed to be in the tornado part of the movie. That scene was supposed to be the first scene you saw after Dorothy was hit in the head with the window and falls down on the bed, and the dream music starts. She was supposed to dream the tornado advancing and enveloping the house. That was always scripted. It was in the rough cut, and they took it out because it was so terrifying, because all of a sudden everybody was now so invested with Judy Garland and that dog in the house, and the storm actually hits the house and disappears in all this smoke or dust. And no, we found all of that tornado raw footage, or what tornado raw footage we found in late 92 or early 93, when we were getting ready to do the deluxe Laserdisc version of The Wizard of Oz, where there was all the room to add anything we could find. And that's where we found the house being dropped from the soundstage roof to the dry ice clouds below so they could run it backwards. The long shots of the tornado that weren't in the movie, the tornado just hanging there like a rope, and then the wind machines are revved up and the tornado is revved up, and they do the engulfing the house. So all this stuff, you can imagine. I was 42 years old and seeing bits of The Wizard of Oz that I had never seen before. And the damnable thing is that I then wanted to go door to door to everybody who had the Laserdisc and sit and watch them see this all for the first time.
But something I only learned, like just talking about the tornado and the effects and everything of it, I think it's not the 4K version, but the one just before that, one of those Blu-ray runs that had this new or documentary on it. But they explained, and I never knew this until only a couple of years ago, that one of those shots of Judy going back to the farm after being with Professor Marvel, and you see her in front of the gate, and then you see the tornado in the house and everything behind her. I had no idea that, we'll say, the tornado in the house was all done miniature, and then with the wind, and then that was rear projected behind the physical gate, and then the wind machine blew Judy, so it looked like one thing. But I just thought, like, how ingenious that's, because I'd watched the film for 20 years and never noticed that was a rear projection thing. Like, it was just incredible.
Well, so much of it is rear projection or matte painting that's put in later, as Connor said. And again, it was absolutely seamless until they started restoring it and cleaning up every frame. And now you can see the seams, but they don't seem to get in the way, which is again, the magic of the Wizard of Oz. You just want to go along and believe it.
Yeah.
No, absolutely true. It was so ingenious and so challenging. I mean, one of the things that I didn't really stop and think about till I was doing the Legendary Film Career book, and that's only a little over a decade ago, is that Judy Garland is in all but like 4 or 5 scenes in that whole film. She's not in Miss Gulch on her bike. She's not in the tornado scenes of the people on the farm. She's not in the scenes of the trio climbing the mountain and getting into the witch's castle. What else is she not in? She's in virtually every other frame of that film, or in every other scene, depending on what take they took. She's in the frame. But again, 16, and it's a miracle that she delivered the way she did. She was a miracle.
So we have the scene with Dorothy in the caught up within the cyclone, and you've got all these characters going past, and you see Miss Gulch turn into the Wicked Witch, all the farm animals, the poor farm animals. Poor cow. And then we have
a petting zoo near Liverpool, please.
Then we have actually London. And I know, Carly, you say you used to rewind the part where she throws the water at the witch. I used to rewind this part all the time where she just lands and goes, oh, oh, oh. Just make me laugh. It used to really tickle me. And then we have her walking to the door and opening it to then reveal colourful Oz. So any opinions, thoughts?
I think we kind of mentioned it earlier, really, didn't we? When we can just imagine. I think even now it hasn't lost any impact when obviously it goes from sepia into colour. And I do think it's a very interesting that it was her double, or her, I want to say a stand-in double, who actually opened the door.
It was both.
Yeah.
Double lens.
Yeah. And actually, I never know. I think because people are so in awe of the Technicolor, you don't actually see her leave the frame. So I think, you don't tend to notice that, do you? So it's so interesting that people think, but I always just think, how did they do that? Did they paint the inside of the house like grey and then have the door? But it's such an iconic moment, isn't it?
And even in the 4K, again, like that shot, you cannot see that there's a difference between that, the walls painted sepia and the scene right before that, where it actually is in sepia. It's so seamless. And can I just say one thing about when she opens the door and then you see her, how beautiful is she in that scene when she first steps out? Oh my God. Just so gorgeous. It always knocks me on my knees.
One of the things that I think, again, is MGM knowing what to do and what not to do. If you've heard the Rhino CD, the 2 CD set that has the underscoring, there are moments in the film that were purposely underscored. The whole parlor scene with Miss Gulch had underscoring in it that they took out because they thought it would play better. You've just had rainbow and da-da-da-da-da-da, and then they get into the parlor and it's just dialogue. And then as soon as they cut out of the parlor, you're back to da 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 da, and they give you that breathing space. It's like, no, we don't need music every foot of this. The whole scene where Judy's drying Bert Lahr's eyes when they meet at the Carter Land, there is underscoring for that as well, that they drop and just let the dialogue carry it. And I think one of the most effective things they do is at the end of the tornado, again, that music is getting louder and building and building and building. And it's gone from folksy and farmy to alarming and terrifying. And Judy's tumbling around in the bed and the house is falling. And we do the crash and we have the, oh, as has been described. And then there is dead silence. You heard Judy picking up the basket. You heard Judy moving the chair out of the way. She walks quietly through the door. And then she opens the door, and all of a sudden, then you get music again. Not only do you get color, but you get music. And it is so dramatically sound, the way they did stuff like that, I think. They really, really knew what they deserved to be MGM, I guess is the best compliment you can give them. So that I don't have to write this, because I've got so much other writing to do, and this has been 4 hours of absolute joy. Thank you for the invitation, deciding amongst yourselves that you would have me here. I am so happy to see, well, Paul, we haven't communicated, but Carly and Connor and I were part of Sarah's college submission.
Yeah.
What, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, whenever it was. So
almost a year ago.
All of you in the Garland Gab when it's posted, but to be able to interact with you and to talk to people who get it and who people respond and people who have had the emotions and can't wait to share. I will be awake for the next 3 days just feeding on this kind of energy.
Oh.
Never hesitate to ask on camera, off camera, ideas, anything I can do to be of help to the Garland Gab, or any of you personally or professionally, please just know I am here.
It's been great.
It's been an honor.
We'll end there. So to paraphrase Harris Yulin, who spoke the words in the American Masters documentary.
When Dorothy Gale entered the land of Oz, Judy Garland entered the realm of immortality.
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
To find out what happens when both Dorothy and Judy Garland set off on their journey to find the magical but elusive wizard, please join us for part 2 of our Wizards of Oz podcast in April. And we will be welcoming back our 2 special guests. I'd like to thank them again for coming on this month's podcast. And please, as always, if you like what we do, please like and subscribe and ring that bell for announcements for any of our future content.
And can I just show you my slippers? Because I've been meaning to do it all day.
Thank you guys for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. And John, your bookcase is so enviable. I've got all my stuff in London, and I'm at my parents' house at the minute. So yeah, I'm looking forward to having a bookcase like that someday.
Wow.
But yeah,
thank you guys for the privilege. I think you're doing wonderful, wonderful work on Judy's behalf. For whatever the opinion is worth, just keep telling it like it is and like it was, and blow the cobwebs off some of these dastardly people. I cleaned that up as best I could. Thank you.